Coming at you live from the beautiful heartland of these good old United States of America, right at the confluence of the mighty Mississippi and the majestic Missouri rivers, St. Charles, Missouri. This is The Rant. I am your host, Charles Lamson. Today be the 8th day of November, year of our Lord, 2019. It's Friday. Today's topic: economic and financial review. First half of the big show, going to have a seance. Going to summon forth the spirit of Alfred Marshall, one of the world's top-notch economists of all time. And we're going to pick his brain, and he's going to talk about his principles of economics. For those of you watching on YouTube, I'm also going to be doing inspirational, motivational, fitness instructional video. That's right. For a 50-year-old disabled guy, workout tips. Today I'm going to be switching things up a little bit. I was using the 10-pound therapeutic bar pretty much exclusively. Now I'm switching to 8-pound dumbbells, and we're going to be doing some bench presses, some what else? Flies, and some military presses, all from the chair. So I'll be taking 30-second, or I'll be taking little, just the goal is just going to keep it moving, 45, 50 minutes, same as always. Using light weights here, taking slight breaks in between sets, counting 30 respirations in between sets, so that's approximately 60 seconds. So then that'll be the first half. I'm going to close at the end of the first half, going to close that summoning ritual, or we're going to close the seance. The seance/summoning ritual with a banishing ritual. We're going to send Alfred Marshall's spirit back to hell where he belongs. And then I'm going to talk about timely top stories in the world of finance, ladies and gentlemen. So you'll definitely want to tell your family, tell your friends. This is going to be an awesome show. Oh, also the second half, we'll be taking calls as well. If you'd like to call in, talk about anything, you have any suggestions or recommendations, what direction you want the show to go in, please feel free. I'm open to anything, man. The show is all about public relations as well, so I want to know what the people out there are thinking, what they want me to do. Hey, this is a lifetime relationship, ladies and gentlemen. We're building relationships here at The Rant with Charles Lamson. Okay, so yeah, if you want to call during the second half, like I said, I won't be taking calls during the first half. We'll be taking calls during the second half, but if you want to call in during that second half, the number is 657-383-1825. Once again, that number is 657-383-1825. 657-383-1825. Just write that down and think of some questions, comments, whatever. Call in on the second half, and I'd be more than happy to take your call. All right, with that, let's bring in the spirit of Alfred Marshall. He's been waiting in the green room. Alfred, are you there? Alfred, please speak to us. We need your advice in these times of great political and economic uncertainty. Please tell us what to do.
Many of those who had adopted the new doctrines in other countries sought on her shores a safe asylum from religious persecution. By a sort of natural selection, those of the French and Flemings and others whose character was most akin to the English, and who had been led by that character to study thoroughness of work in the manufacturing arts, came to mingle with them and to teach them those arts for which their character had all along fitted them. During the 17th and 18th centuries, The court and the upper classes remained more or less frivolous and licentious, but the middle class and some parts of the working class adopted a severe view of life. They took little delight in amusements that interrupted work, and they had a high standard as to those material comforts which could be obtained only by unremitting hard work. They strove to produce things that had a solid and lasting utility, rather than those that suited only for the purposes of festivities and ostentation. The tendency, when once it had set in, was promoted by the climate, for though not very severe, it is specially unsuited to the lighter amusements, and the clothing, house room, and other requisites for a comfortable existence in it are of a specially expensive character. These were the conditions under which the modern industrial life of England was developing. The desire for material comforts tends towards a ceaseless straining to extract from every week the greatest amount of work that can be got out of it. The firm resolution to submit every action to the deliberate judgment of the reason tends to make everyone constantly ask himself whether he could not improve his position by changing his business, or by changing his method of doing it. And lastly, complete political freedom and security enables everyone to adjust his conduct as he has decided that it is in his interest to do, and fearlessly to commit his person and his property to new and distant undertakings. In short, the same causes which have enabled England and her colonies to set the tone of modern politics have made them also set the tone of modern business. The same qualities which gave them political freedom gave them also free enterprise in industry and commerce. Section 13. Freedom of industry and enterprise, so far as its action reaches, tends to cause everyone to seek that employment of his labor and capital in which he can turn them to the best advantage, and this again leads him to try to obtain a special skill and facility in some particular task, by which he may earn the means of purchasing what he himself wants, and hence results a complex industrial organization with much subtle division of labor. Some sort of division of labor is indeed sure to grow up in any civilization that has held together for a long while, however primitive its form. Even in very backward countries, we find highly specialized trades, but we do not find the work within each trade so divided up that the planning and arrangement of the business, its management, and its risks are borne by one set of people, while the manual work required for it is done by hired labor. This form of division of labor is at once characteristic of the modern world generally, and of the English race in particular. It may be merely a passing phase in man's development. It may be swept away by the further growth of that free enterprise which has called it into existence. But for the present, it stands out for good and for evil as the chief fact in the form of modern civilization, the kernel of the modern economic problem. The most vital changes hitherto introduced into industrial life center around this growth of business undertakers. We have already seen how the undertaker made his appearance at an early stage in England's agriculture. The farmer borrowed land from his landlord and hired the necessary labor, being himself responsible for the management and risks of the business. The selection of farmers has not indeed been governed by perfectly free competition, but it has been restricted to a certain extent by inheritance and by other influences, which have often caused the leadership of agricultural industry to fall into the hands of people who have had no special talent for it. But England is the only country in which any considerable play has been given to natural selection. The agricultural systems of the continent have allowed the accident of birth to determine the part which every man should take in cultivating land, or controlling its cultivation. The greater energy and elasticity obtained by even this narrow play of selection in England has been sufficient to put English agriculture in advance of all others, and has enabled it to obtain a much larger produce than is got by an equal amount of labor from similar soils in any other country of Europe. But the natural selection of the fittest to undertake, to organize, and to manage has much greater scope in manufacture. The tendency to the growth of undertakers in manufactures had set in before the great development of England's foreign trade. In fact, traces of it are to be found in the woolen manufacture in the 15th century. But the opening up of large markets in new countries gave a great stimulus to the movement, both directly and through its influence on the localization of industry. That is, the concentration of particular branches of production in certain localities. The records of medieval fairs and wandering merchants shows that there were many things, each of which was made in only one or two places, and thence distributed north and south, east and west, over the whole of Europe. But the wares whose production was localized, and which traveled far, were almost always of high price and small bulk. The cheaper and heavier goods were supplied by each district for itself. In the colonies of the New World, however, people had not always the leisure to provide manufactures for themselves, and they were often not allowed to make even those which they could have made. For though England's treatment of her colonies was more liberal than that of any other country, she thought that the expense which she incurred on their behalf justified her in compelling them to buy nearly all kinds of manufactures from herself. There was also a large demand for simple goods to be sold in India and to savage races. These causes led to the localization of much of the heavier manufacturing work. In work which requires the highly trained skill and delicate fancy of the operative, organization is sometimes of secondary importance. But the power of organizing great numbers of people gives an irresistible advantage when there is a demand for whole ship cargoes of goods of a few simple patterns. Thus, localization and the growth of the system of capitalist undertakers were two parallel movements, due to the same general cause, and each of them promoting the advance of the other. The factory system and the use of expensive appliances in manufacture came at a later stage. They are commonly supposed to be the origin of the power which undertakers wield in English industry, and no doubt they increased it. But it had shown itself clearly before their influence was felt. At the time of the French Revolution, there was not a very great deal of capital invested in machinery, whether driven by water or steam power. The factories were not large, and there were not many of them. But nearly all the textile work of the country was then done on a system of contracts. This industry was controlled by a comparatively small number of undertakers who set themselves to find out what, where, and when it was most advantageous to buy and to sell, and what things it was most profitable to have made. They then let out contracts for making these things to a great number of people scattered over the country. The undertakers generally supplied the raw material, and sometimes even the simple implements that were used. Those who took the contract executed it by the labor of themselves and their families, and sometimes, but not always, by that of a few assistants. As time went on, the progress of mechanical invention caused the workers to be gathered more and more into small factories in the neighborhood of water power, and when steam came to be substituted for water power, then into larger factories in great towns. Thus, the great undertakers who bore the chief risks of manufacturing, without directly managing and superintending, began to give way to wealthy employers who conducted the whole business of manufacturing on a large scale. New factories attracted the attention of the most careless observer, and this last movement was not liable to be overlooked by those who were not actually engaged in the trade, as the preceding movement had been. Thus, at length, general attention was called to the great change in the organization of industry which had long been going on, and it was seen that the system of small businesses controlled by the workers themselves was being displaced by the system of large businesses controlled by the specialized ability of capitalist undertakers. The change would have worked itself out very much as it has done, even if there had been no factories. and it will go on working itself out even if the retail distribution of force by electric or other agencies should cause part of the work that is now done in factories to be taken to the home of the workers. Section 14. The new movement, both in its earlier and later forms, has tended constantly to relax the bonds that used to bind nearly everyone to live in the parish in which he was born. And it developed free markets for labor, which invited people to come and take their chance at finding employment. And in consequence of this change, the causes that determine the value of labor began to take a new character. Up to the 18th century, manufacturing labor had been hired, as a rule, retail, though a large and fluid labor class, which could be hired wholesale, had played a considerable part in the industrial history of particular places on the continent and in England before then. In that century, the rule was reversed, at least for England, and the price of labor ceased to be dominated by custom or by bargaining in small markets. During the last 100 years, it had even more and more been determined by the circumstances of supply and demand over a large area, a town, a country, or the whole world. The new organization of industry added vastly to the efficiency of production, for it went far toward securing that each man's labor should be devoted to just the highest kind of work which he was capable of performing well, and that his work should be ably directed and supplied with the best mechanical and other assistance that wealth and the knowledge of the age could afford. But it brought with it great evils. Which of these evils was avoidable, we cannot tell, for just when the change was moving most quickly, England was stricken by a combination of calamities almost unparalleled in history. They were the cause of a great part, it is impossible to say of how great a part, of the sufferings that are commonly ascribed to the sudden outbreak of unrestrained competition. The loss of her great colonies was quickly followed by the Great French War, which cost her more than the total value of the accumulated wealth she had at its commencement. An unprecedented series of bad harvests made bread fearfully dear. And worse than all, a method of administration of the poor law was adopted which undermined the independence and vigor of the people. The first part of the last century therefore saw free enterprise establishing itself in England under favorable circumstances, its evils being intensified and its beneficial influences being hindered by external misfortunes. Section 15. The trade customs and the guild regulations by which the weak had been defended in past times were unsuitable to the new industry. In some places, they were abandoned by common consent. In others, they were successfully upheld for a time. But it was a fatal success, for the new industry, incapable of flourishing under the old bonds, left those places for others where it could be more free. Then the workers turned to the government for the enforcement of the old laws of Parliament prescribing the way in which the trade should be carried on, and even for the revival of the regulation of prices and wages by justices of the peace. These efforts could not but fail. The old regulations had been the expression of the social, moral, and economic ideas of the time. They had been felt out rather than thought out. They were the most instinctive results of the experience of generations of men who had lived and died under almost unchanged economic conditions. In the new age, changes came so rapidly that there was no time for this. Each man had to do what was right in his own eyes, but with little guidance from the experience of past times. Those who endeavored to cling to old traditions were quickly supplanted. The new race of undertakers consisted chiefly of those who had made their own fortunes, strong, ready, enterprising men, who, looking at the success obtained by their own energies, were apt to assume that the poor and the weak were to be blamed rather than to be pitied for their misfortunes. Impressed with the folly of those who tried to bolster up economic arrangements, which the stream of progress had undermined, they were apt to think that nothing more was wanted than to make competition perfectly free and to let the strongest have their way. They glorified individuality of character, and they were in no hurry to find a modern substitute for the social and industrial bonds which had kept men together in earlier times. Meanwhile, misfortune had reduced the total net income of the people of England. In 1820, a tenth of it was absorbed in paying the mere interest on the national debt. The goods that were cheapened by the new inventions were chiefly manufactured commodities, of which the working men were but a small consumer. As England had then almost a monopoly of manufactures, he might indeed have got his food cheaply if manufacturers had been allowed to change their wares freely for corn grown abroad. But this was prohibited by the landlords who ruled in Parliament. The laborers' wages, so far as they were spent on ordinary food, were the equivalent of what his labor would produce on the very poor soil which was forced into cultivation to eke out the insufficient supplies raised from the richer grounds. He had to sell his labor in a market in which the forces of supply and demand would have given him a poor pittance, even if they had worked freely. But he had not the full advantage of economic freedom. He had no efficient union with his fellows. He had neither the knowledge of the market nor the power of holding out for a reserve price, which the seller of commodities has, and he was urged on to work and to let his family work during long hours and under unhealthy conditions. This reacted on the efficiency of the working population, and therefore on the net value of their work, and therefore it kept down their wages. The employment of very young children for long hours was no new thing. It had been common in Norwich and elsewhere, even in the 17th century. But the moral and physical misery and disease caused by excessive work under bad conditions reached their highest point among the factory population in the first quarter of the century. They diminished slowly during the second quarter, and more rapidly since then. After the workmen had recognized the folly of attempts to revive the old rules regulating industry, there was no longer any wish to curtail the freedom of enterprise. The sufferings of the English people at their worst were never comparable to those which had been caused by the want of freedom in France before the Revolution, and it was argued that, had it not been for the strength which England derived from her new industries, she would probably have succumbed to a foreign military despotism, as the free cities had done before her. Small as her population was, she at times bore almost alone the burden of war against a conqueror in control of nearly all the resources of the continent, and at other times subsidized larger but poorer countries in the struggle against him. Rightly or wrongly, it was thought at the time that Europe might have fallen permanently under the dominion of France, as she had fallen in an earlier age under that of Rome, had not the free energy of English industry supplied the sinews of war against the common foe. Little was therefore heard in complaint against the excess of free enterprise, but much against that limitation of it which prevented Englishmen from obtaining food from abroad in return for the manufactures which they could now so easily produce. And even trade unions, which were then beginning that brilliant though checkered career which has been more full of interest and instruction than almost anything else in English history, passed into the phase of seeking little from authority except to be left alone. They had learned by bitter experience the folly of attempting to enforce the old rules by which government had directed the course of industry, and they had as yet got no far-reaching views as to the regulation of trade by their own action. Their chief anxiety was to increase their own economic freedom by the removal of the laws against combinations of workmen. Section 16. It has been left for our own generation to perceive all the evils which arose from the suddenness of this increase of economic freedom. Now first are we getting to understand the extent to which the capitalist employer, untrained to his new duties, was tempted to subordinate the well-being of his work people to his own desire for gain. Now first are we learning the importance of insisting that the rich have duties as well as rights in their individual and in their collective capacity. Now first is the economic problem of the new age showing itself to us as it really is. This is partly due to a wider knowledge and a growing earnestness. But however wise and virtuous our grandfathers had been, they could not have seen things as we do, for they were hurried along by urgent necessities and terrible disasters. We must judge ourselves by a severer standard, for though England has recently been called on to struggle once more for national existence, her powers of production have been immensely increased. Free trade and the growth of steam communication have enabled a largely increased population to obtain sufficient supplies of food on easy terms. The average money income of the people has more than doubled, while the price of almost all important commodities except animal food and house room has fallen by 1/2 or even further. It is true that even now, if wealth were distributed equally, the total production of the country would only suffice to provide necessaries and the more urgent comforts for the people, and that as things are, many have barely the necessaries of life. But the nation has grown in wealth, in health, in education, and in morality, and we are no longer compelled to subordinate almost every other consideration to the need of increasing the total produce of industry. In particular, this increased prosperity has made us rich and strong enough to impose new restraints on free enterprise. Some temporary material loss being submitted to for the sake of a higher and ultimate greater gain. But these new restraints are different from the old. They are imposed not as a means of class domination, but with the purpose of defending the weak, and especially children and the mothers of children, in matters in which they are not able to use the forces of competition in their own defense. The aim is to devise, deliberately and promptly, remedies adapted to the quickly changing circumstances of modern industry, and thus to obtain the good without the evil of the old defense of the weak that in other ages was gradually evolved by custom. Even when industry remained almost unchanged in character for many generations together, custom was too slow in its growth and too blind to be able to apply pressure only when pressure was beneficial. And in this later stage, custom can do but little good and much harm. But by the aid of the telegraph and the printing press, of representative government and trade associations, it is possible for the people to think out for themselves the solution of their own problems. The growth of knowledge and self-reliance has given them that true self-controlling freedom, which enables them to impose of their own free will restraints on their own actions, and the problems of collective production, collective ownership, and collective consumption are entering on a new phase. Projects for great and sudden change are now, as ever, foredoomed to fail and to cause reaction. We cannot move safely if we move so fast that our new plans of life together outrun our instincts. It is true that human nature can be modified. New ideals, new opportunities, and new methods of action may, as history shows, alter it very much, even in a few generations. And this change in human nature has perhaps never covered so wide an area and moved so fast as in the present generation. But still, it is a growth, and therefore gradual, and changes of our social organization must wait on it, and therefore they must be gradual too. But though they wait on it, they may always keep a little in advance of it, promoting the growth of our higher social nature by giving it always some new and higher work to do, some practical ideal towards which to strive. Thus gradually we may attain to an order of social life, in which the common good overrules individual caprice, even more than it did in the early ages before the sway of individualism had begun. But unselfishness then will be the offspring of deliberate will. And though aided by instinct, individual freedom will then develop itself in collective freedom, a happy contrast to the old order of life, in which individual slavery to custom caused collective slavery and stagnation, broken only by the caprice of despotism or the caprice of revolution. Section 17. We have been looking at this movement from the British point of view, but other nations are hastening in the same direction. America faces new practical difficulties with such intrepidity and directness that she has already attained leadership in some economic affairs. She supplies many of the most instructive instances of the latest economic tendencies of the age, such as the development of speculation and trade combination in every form, and she will probably before long take the chief part in pioneering the way for the rest of the world. Australia also shows signs of vigor, and she has indeed some advantage over the United States in the greater homogeneity of her people. For though the Australians, and nearly the same may be said of the Canadians, come from many lands, and thus stimulate one another to thought and enterprise by a variety of their experiences and their habits of thought, yet nearly all of them belong to one race, and the development of social institutions can proceed in some respects more easily and faster than if they had to be adjusted to the capacities and temperaments, the tastes, and the wants of people who have had little affinity with one another. On the continent, the powers of obtaining important results by free association is less than in English-speaking countries, and in consequence there is less resource and less thoroughness in dealing with industrial problems. But their treatment is not quite the same in any two nations, and there is something characteristic and instructive in the methods adopted by each of them, particularly in relation to the sphere of governmental action. In this matter, Germany is taking the lead. It has been a great gain to her that her manufacturing industries developed later than those of England, and she has been able to profit by England's experience and to avoid many of her mistakes. In Germany, an especially large part of the best intellect in the nation seeks for employment under government, and there is probably no other government which contains within itself so much trained ability of the highest order. On the other hand, the energy, the originality, and the daring which make the best men of business in England and America have but recently been fully developed in Germany, while the German people have a great faculty for obedience. They thus differ from the English, whose strength of will makes them capable of thorough discipline when strong occasion arises, but who are not naturally docile. The control of industry by government is seen in its best and most attractive forms in Germany, and at the same time, the special virtues of private industry, its vigor, its elasticity, and its resource are beginning to be seen in full development there. In consequence, the problems of the economic functions of government have been studied in Germany with great care, and with results that may be very instructive to English-speaking people, provided they recollect that the arrangements best suited for the German character are perhaps not quite the best for them, since they could not, if they would, rival the Germans in their steadfast docility and in their easy contentment with inexpensive kinds of food, clothing, house room, and amusements. And Germany contains a larger number than any other country of the most cultivated members of that wonderful race who have been leaders of the world in intensity of religious feeling and in keenness of business speculation. In every country, but especially in Germany, much of what is most brilliant and suggestive in economic practice and in economic thought is of Jewish origin. And in particular to German Jews, we owe many daring speculations as to the conflicts of interest between the individual and society, and as to their ultimate economic causes and their possible socialistic remedies. But we are trenching on a subject of Appendix B. Here we have seen how recent is the growth of economic freedom, and how new is the substance of the problem with which economic science has now to deal. We have next to inquire how the form of that problem has been fashioned by the progress of events and the personal peculiarities of great thinkers. End of Appendix A, sections 9 through 17. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Appendix B of Principles of Economics. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Principles of Economics by Alfred Marshall. Appendix B. The Growth of Economic Science. Section 1. We have seen how economic freedom has its roots in the past, but is in the main a product of quite recent times. We have next to trace the parallel growth of economic science. The social conditions of the present day have been developed from early Aryan and Semitic institutions by aid of Greek thought and Roman law, but modern economic speculations have been very little under the direct influence of the theories of the ancients. It is true that modern economics had its origin in common with other sciences at the time when the study of classic writers was reviving. But an industrial system which was based on slavery and a philosophy which regarded manufacture and commerce with contempt had little that was congenial to the hardy burghers, who were as proud of their handicrafts and their trade as they were of their share in governing the state. These strong but uncultured men might have gained much from philosophic temper and the broad interests of the great thinkers of past times, but as it was, they set themselves to work out their own problems for themselves, and modern economics had at its origin a certain rudeness and limitation of scope, and a bias towards regarding wealth as an end rather than a means of man's life. Its immediate concern was generally with the public revenue and the effects and yield of taxes. And here the statesmen of the free cities and the great empires alike found their economic problems more urgent and more difficult, as trade became broader and war more expensive. In all ages, but especially in the early Middle Ages, statesmen and merchants had busied themselves with endeavors to enrich the state by regulating trade. One chief object of their concern had been the supply of the precious metals, which they thought the best indication, if not the chief cause of material prosperity, whether of the individual or the nation. But the voyages of Vasco da Gama and Columbus raised commercial questions from a secondary to a dominating position among the nations of Western Europe. Theories with regard to the importance of the precious metals and the best means of obtaining supplies of them became in some measure the arbiters of public policy, dictating peace and war, and determining alliances that issued in the rise and fall of nations. And at times, they largely influenced the migration of peoples over the face of the globe. Regulations as to trade in the precious metals were but one group of a vast body of ordinances, which undertook, with varying degrees of minuteness and severity, to arrange for each individual what he should produce and how he should produce it, what he should earn and how he should spend his earnings. The natural adhesiveness of the Teutons had given custom an exceptional strength in the early Middle Ages, and this strength told on the side of trade guilds, of local authorities, and of national governments when they set themselves to cope with the restless tendency to change that sprang directly or indirectly from the trade with the New World. In France, this Teutonic bias was directed by the Roman genius for system, and paternal government reached its zenith. The trade regulations of Colbert have become a proverb. It was just at this time that economic theory first took shape. The so-called mercantile system became prominent, and regulation was pursued with a masterful rigor that had not been known before. As years went on, there set in a tendency towards economic freedom, and those who were opposed to the new ideas claimed on their side the authority of the mercantilists of a past generation. But the spirit of regulation and restriction which is found in their systems belonged to the age. Many of the changes which they set themselves to bring about were in the direction of the freedom of enterprise. In particular, they argued, in opposition to those who wished to prohibit absolutely the exportation of the precious metals, that it should be permitted in all cases in which the trade would in the long run bring more gold and silver into the country than it took out, by thus raising the question whether the state would not benefit by allowing the trader to manage his business as he liked in one particular case. They had started a new tendency of thought, and this moved on by imperceptible steps in the direction of economic freedom, being assisted on its way by the circumstances of the time, no less than by the tone and temper of men's minds in Western Europe. The broadening movement did go on, till in the later half of the 18th century, the time was ripe for the doctrine that the well-being of the community almost always suffers when the state attempts to oppose its own artificial regulations to the natural liberty of every man to manage his own affairs in his own way. Section 2. The first systematic attempt to form an economic science on a broad basis was made in France about the middle of the 18th century by a group of statesmen and philosophers under the leadership of Quesnay, the noble-minded physician to Louis XV. The cornerstone of their policy was obedience to nature. They were the first to proclaim the doctrine of free trade as a broad principle of action, going in this respect beyond even such advanced English writers as Sir Dudley North, and there was much in the tone and temper of their treatment of political and social questions which was prophetic of a later age. They fell, however, into a confusion of thought which was common even among scientific men of their time, but which has been banished after a long struggle from the physical sciences. They confused the ethical principle of conformity to nature, which is expressed in the imperative mood, and prescribes certain laws of action with those causal laws which science discovers by interrogating nature, and which are expressed in the indicative mood. For this and other reasons, their work has but little direct value. But its indirect influence on the present position of economics has been very great. For firstly, the clearness and logical consistency of their arguments have caused them to exercise a great influence on later thought. And secondly, the chief motive of their study was not, as it had been with most of their predecessors, to increase the riches of merchants and fill the exchequers of kings. It was to diminish the suffering and degradation which was caused by extreme poverty. They thus gave to economics its modern aim of seeking after such knowledge as may help to raise the quality of human life. Section 3. The next great step in advance, the greatest step that economics has ever taken, was the work, not of a school, but of an individual. Adam Smith was not indeed the only great English economist of his time. Shortly before he wrote, important additions to economic theory had been made by Hume and Stewart, and excellent studies of economic facts had been published by Andreesen and Young. But Adam Smith's breadth was sufficient to include all that was best in all his contemporaries, French and English, and though he undoubtedly borrowed much from others, yet the more one compares him with those who went before and those who came after him, the finer does his genius appear, the broader his knowledge, and the more well-balanced his judgment. He resided a long time in France in personal congress with the physiocrats. He made a careful study of the English and French philosophy of his time, and he got to know the world practically by wide travel and by intimate association with Scotch men of business. To these advantages he added unsurpassed powers of observation, judgment, and reasoning. The result is that wherever he differs from his predecessors, he is more nearly right than they, while there is scarcely any economic truth now known of which he did not get some glimpse. And since he was the first to write a treatise on wealth in all its chief social respects, he might on this ground alone have claim to be regarded as the founder of modern economics. But the area which he opened up was too vast to be thoroughly surveyed by one man, and many truths of which at times he caught sight escaped from his view at other times. It is therefore possible to quote his authority in support of many errors, though on examination he is always found to be working his way towards the truth. He developed the physiocratic doctrine of free trade with so much practical wisdom, and with so much knowledge of the actual conditions of business, as to make it a great force in real life. And he is most widely known both here and abroad for his arguments that government generally does harm by interfering in trade. While giving many instances of the ways in which self-interest may lead the individual trader to act injuriously to the community, he contended that even when government acted with the best intentions, It nearly always served the public worse than the enterprise of the individual trader, however selfish he might happen to be. So great an impression did he make on the world by his defense of this doctrine, that most German writers have it chiefly in view when they speak of Smithianismus. But after all, this was not his chief work. His chief work was to combine and develop the speculations of his French and English contemporaries and predecessors as to value. His highest claim to have made an epoch in thought is that he was the first to make a careful and scientific inquiry into the manner in which value measures human motive, on the one side measuring the desire of purchasers to obtain wealth, and on the other the efforts and sacrifices or real cost of production undergone by its producers. Possibly the full drift of what he was doing was not seen by him. Certainly it was not perceived by many of his followers. But for all of that, the best economic work which came after The Wealth of Nations is distinguished from that which went before by a clearer insight into the balancing and weighing, by means of money, of the desire for the possession of a thing on the one hand, and on the other of all the various efforts and self-denials which directly and indirectly contribute towards making it. Important as had been the steps that others had taken in this direction, the advance made by him was so great that he really opened out this new point of view, and by so doing made an epoch. In this he and the economists who went before and came after him were not inventing a new academic notion. They were merely giving definiteness and precision to notions that are familiar in common life. In fact, the ordinary man, without analytical habits of mind, is apt to regard money as measuring motive and happiness more closely and exactly than it actually does. And this is partly because he does not think out the manner in which the measurement is effected. Economic language seems technical and less real than that of common life. But in truth, it is more real, because it is more careful and takes more account of differences and difficulties. Section 4. None of Adam Smith's contemporaries and immediate successors had a mind as broad and well-balanced as his. But they did excellent work, each giving himself up to some class of problems to which he was attracted by the natural bent of his genius, or the special events of the time in which he wrote. During the remainder of the 18th century, the chief economic writings were historical and descriptive, and bore upon the condition of the working classes, especially in the agricultural districts. Arthur Young continued the inimitable records of his tour. Eden wrote a history of the poor, which has served both as a basis and as a model for all succeeding historians of industry, while Mathis showed by a careful investigation of history what were the forces which had, as a matter of fact, controlled the growth of population in different countries and at different times. But on the whole, the most influential of the immediate successors of Adam Smith was Bentham. He wrote little on economics himself, but he went far towards setting the tone of the rising school of English economists at the beginning of the 19th century. He was an uncompromising logician, and averse to all restrictions and regulations for which no clear reason could be given, and his pitiless demands that they should justify their existence received support from the circumstances of the age. England had won her unique position in the world by her quickness in adapting herself to every new economic movement, while by their adherence to old-fashioned ways, the nations of Central Europe had been prevented from turning to account their great natural resources. The businessmen of England, therefore, were inclined to think that the influence of custom and sentiment in business affairs was harmful, that in England at least it had diminished, was diminishing, and would soon vanish away. And the disciples of Bentham were not slow to conclude that they need not concern themselves much about custom. It was enough for them to discuss the tendencies of man's action on the supposition that everyone was always on the alert to find out what course would best promote his own interest, and was free and quick to follow it. There is then some justice in the charges frequently brought against the English economists of the beginning of the last century, that they neglected to inquire with sufficient care whether a greater range might not be given to collective as opposed to individual action in social and economic affairs, and that they exaggerated the strength of competition and its rapidity of action. And there is some ground, though a very slight one, for the charge that their work is marred by a certain hardness of outline and even harshness of temper. These faults were partly due to Bentham's direct influence, partly to the spirit of the age of which he was an exponent. But they were partly also due to the fact that economic study had again got a good deal into the hands of men whose strength lay in vigorous action rather than in philosophical thought. Section 5. Statesmen and merchants again threw themselves into problems of money and foreign trade with even more energy than they used to do when these questions were first started in the earlier period of the economic change at the end of the Middle Ages. It might at first seem probable that their contact with real life, their wide experience, and their vast knowledge of facts would have led them to take a wide survey of human nature and to found their reasonings on a broad basis. But the training of practical life often leads to a too rapid generalization from personal experience. So long as they were well within their own province, their work was excellent. The theory of currency is just that part of economic science in which but little harm is done by neglecting to take much account of any human motives except the desire for wealth. And the brilliant school of deductive reasoning, which Ricardo led, was here on safe ground. The economists next addressed themselves to the theory of foreign trade and cleared away many of the flaws which Adam Smith had left in it. There is no other part of economics, except the theory of money, which so nearly falls within the range of pure deductive reasoning. It is true that a full discussion of a free trade policy must take account of many considerations that are not strictly economic. But most of these, though important for agricultural countries, and especially for new countries, had little bearing in the case of England. During all this time, the study of economic facts was not neglected in England. The statistical studies of Petty, Arthur Young, Eaton, and others were ably continued by Tuke, McCulloch, and Porter. And though it may be true that an undue prominence is given in their writings to those facts which were of direct interest to merchants and other capitalists, the same cannot be said of the admirable series of parliamentary inquiries into the condition of the working classes, which were brought about by the influence of the economists. In fact, the public and private collection of statistics and the economic histories that were produced in England at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th may fairly be regarded as the origin of systematic historical and statistical studies in economics. Nevertheless, there was a certain narrowness in their work. It was truly historical, but for the greater part it was not comparative. Hume, Adam Smith, Arthur Young, and others had been led by their own instinctive genius, and the example of Montesquieu occasionally to compare social facts of different ages and different countries, and to draw lessons from the comparison. But no one had grasped the notion of comparative study of history on a systematic plan. In consequence, the writers of that time, able and earnest as they were in their search for the actual facts of life, worked rather at haphazard. They overlooked whole groups of facts which we now see to be of vital importance, and they often failed to make the best use of those which they collected. And this narrowness was intensified when they passed from the collection of facts to general reasonings about them. Section 6. For the sake of simplicity of argument, Ricardo and his followers often spoke as though they regarded man as a constant quantity, and they never gave themselves enough trouble to study his variations. The people whom they knew most intimately were city men, and they sometimes expressed themselves so carelessly as almost to imply that other Englishmen were very much like those whom they knew in the city. They were aware that the inhabitants of other countries had peculiarities of their own that deserved study, but they seemed to regard such differences as superficial and sure to be removed, as soon as other nations had got to know that better way which Englishmen were ready to teach them. The same bent of mind that led our lawyers to impose English civil law on the Hindus led our economists to work out their theories on the tacit supposition that the world was made up of city men. And though this did little harm so long as they were treating of money and foreign trade, it led them astray as to the relations between the different industrial classes. It caused them to speak of labor as a commodity, without staying to throw themselves into the point of view of the workman, and without dwelling upon the allowances to be made for his human passions, his instincts and habits, his sympathies and antipathies, his class jealousies and class adhesiveness, his want of knowledge and of the opportunities for free and vigorous action. They therefore attributed to the forces of supply and demand a much more mechanical and regular action than is to be found in real life. And they laid down laws with regard to profits and wages that did not really hold even for England in their own time. But their most vital fault was that they did not see how liable to change are the habits and institutions of industry. In particular, they did not see that the poverty of the poor is the chief cause of that weakness and inefficiency which are the causes of their poverty. They had not the faith that modern economists have in the possibility of a vast improvement in the condition of the working classes. The perfectibility of man had indeed been asserted by the socialists, but their views were based on little historic and scientific study, and were expressed with an extravagance that moved the contempt of the business-like economists of the age. The socialists did not study the doctrines which they attacked, and there was no difficulty in showing that they had not understood the nature and efficiency of the existing economic organization of society. The economists therefore did not trouble themselves to examine carefully any of their doctrines, and least of all their speculations as to human nature. But the socialists were men who had felt intensely, and who knew something about the hidden springs of human action of which the economists took no account. Buried among their wild rhapsodies, there were shrewd observations and pregnant suggestions from which philosophers and economists had much to learn. And gradually their influence began to tell. Comte's debts to them were very great, and the crisis of John Stuart Mill's life, as he tells us in his autobiography, came to him from reading them. Section 7. When comparing the modern view of the vital problem of the distribution of wealth with that which prevailed at the beginning of the last century, we have found that, over and above all changes in detail and all improvements in scientific accuracy of reasoning, there is a fundamental change in treatment. For while the earlier economists argued as though man's character and efficiency were to be regarded as a fixed quantity, modern economists keep constantly in mind the fact that it is a product of the circumstances under which he has lived. This change in the point of view of economics is partly due to the fact that the changes in human nature during the last 50 years have been so rapid as to force themselves on the attention, partly to the direct influence of individual writers, socialists, and others, and partly to the indirect influence of a similar change in some branches of natural science. At the beginning of the last century, the mathematico-physical group of sciences were in the ascendant, and these sciences, widely as they differ from one another, have this point in common, that their subject matter is constant and unchanged in all countries and in all ages. The progress of science was familiar to men's minds, but the development of the subject matter of science was strange to them. As the century wore on, the biological group of sciences were slowly making way, and people were getting clearer ideas as to the nature of organic growth. They were learning that if the subject matter of a science passes through different stages of development, the laws which apply to one stage will seldom apply without modification to others. The laws of science must have a development corresponding to that of the things of which they treat. The influence of this new notion gradually spread to the sciences which relate to man, and showed itself in the works of Goethe, Hegel, Kant, and others. At last the speculations of biology made a great stride forwards. Its discoveries fascinated the attention of the world, as those of physics had done in earlier years. And there was a marked change in the tone of the moral and historical sciences. Economics has shared in the general movement and is getting to pay every year a greater attention to the pliability of human nature and to the way in which the character of man affects and is affected by the prevalent methods of the production, distribution, and consumption of wealth. The first important indication of the new movement was seen in John Stuart Mill's admirable Principles of Political Economy. Mill's followers have continued his movement away from the position taken up by the immediate followers of Ricardo, and the human as distinguished from the mechanical element is taking a more and more prominent place in economics. Not to mention writers yet living, the new temper is shown in Cliff Leslie's historical inquiries and in the many-sided works of Bagehot, Cairns, Toynbee, and others, but above all in that of Jevons, which has secured a permanent and notable place in economic history by its rare combination of many various qualities of the highest order. A higher notion of social duty is spreading everywhere. In Parliament, in the press, and in the pulpit, the spirit of humanity speaks more distinctly and more earnestly. Mill and the economists who have followed him have helped onwards this general movement, and they, in their turn, have been helped onwards by it. Partly for this reason, partly in consequence of the modern growth of historical science, their study of facts has been broader and more philosophic. It is true that the historical and statistical work of some of the earlier economists has seldom, if ever, been surpassed. But much information, which is beyond their reach, is now accessible to everyone, and economists who have neither McCullough's familiarity with practical business nor his vast historical learning are enabled to get a view of the relations of economic doctrine to the true facts of life, which is both broader and clearer than his. In this, they have been helped by the general improvement which has taken place in the methods of all sciences, including that of history. Thus, in every way, economic reasoning is now more exact than it was. The premises assumed in any inquiry are stated with more rigid precision than formerly. But this greater exactness of thought is partly destructive in its action. It is showing that many of the older applications of general reasoning were invalid, because no care had been taken to think out all the assumptions that were implied, and to see whether they could fairly be made in the special cases under discussion. As a result, many dogmas have been destroyed, which appeared to be simple only because they were loosely expressed, but which, for that very reason, served as an armory with which partisan disputants, chiefly of the capitalist class, have equipped themselves for the fray. This destructive work might appear at first sight to have diminished the value of processes of general reasoning in economics, but really it has had the opposite result. It has cleared the ground for newer and stronger machinery, which is being steadily and patiently built up. It has enabled us to take broader views of life, to proceed more sure.
Okay, Alfred, thank you. That first half drug on a little longer than usual. But it could not be helped, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. Could not be helped. Had to take care of some stuff. Okay. Anyway. So, hey, all right. What are we doing here? All right. So now we're going to be doing the banishing ritual. We're going to end the seance. Spirit, be gone! Be gone with you, Alfred Marshall, till I call you forth again for the next installment of the Economic and Financial Review. Once again, this is not something I'm going to keep doing all the time. I guess it might be something I do. It's fairly more common, but those of you who are regulars of the show, regular listeners, watchers, whatever, blog audience, what have you. I usually my blog is all it's usually this show is pretty much centered around my whole blog. So I usually I'm a fan. I like reading books, anything having to do with business administration, economics, finance, communications, business communications, marketing, public relations, all that sort of stuff. And I like to read these books and then do analyses of them and put them on my blog. And then I usually just kind of use that as a teleprompter for my show. In the first half, I kind of dig up recordings of audio books on finance and economics and whatnot, or all kinds of different stuff, really. I dug up some Manly P. Hall clips in the past, and Aristotle and Aristotle. So there's just anything that I think would be, kind of relevant as far as trying to come up with solutions for these times of political and economic uncertainty, turmoil, whatever. It's all about solutions, ladies and gentlemen. So anyway, my point being, I kind of caught up with myself, though. I went through all my blog material, and right now I'm currently in the middle of an analysis of a book. It's called I'm in the middle of an analysis that's going to be, those of you who are readers of the blog, by the way, that blog is charleslamson.blogspot.com. The greatest blog of all time, charleslamson.blogspot.com. So, anyway, I'm kind of right in the middle of an analysis right now. It's managing for competitive advantage. I do a lot of management stuff as well. So, anyway, I kind of told myself, if I ever catch up, I find myself where I can't really, if I run out of blog material based on the analyses of the books that I've been reading, I can always just sort of switch it to a financial show and talk about timely top stories in the world of finance during the second half. And so that's what we're doing right now. That's a little explanation of why I kind of switched gears here. But that being said, let's see what's new in the wonderful world of financial investing. The wonderful world of global finance. The high-stakes, cutthroat world of global finance. What do we got going on here? Whopper discount mistake cost Burger King franchise $8 million. Whoops. Coming at you from Kate Burno, or Burno. I'm going to say it's Burno. From Newswire. Thank you, Kate, for contributing this story to us. To err is human, right? No one is perfect at their jobs, and we're all bound to make work mistakes, both small and large. But if you've ever accidentally CC'd the wrong person on an email or filed a TPS report without a cover sheet, rest assured that your error probably didn't cost your company $8.3 million. Human error cost Burger King in a big way when certain Whopper discounts were applied across hundreds of Burger King locations owned by one franchise company, Restaurant Business reports. The convoluted mistake occurred over the summer as additional discounts were applied on top of an already existing Whopper promotion. Carroll's Restaurant Group is Burger King's largest operator, and it generally outperforms other locations. So when the company noticed it had only posted 4.5% growth in same-store sales, behind the company's 5% overall growth rate, it decided to dig further into the numbers. That's when it discovered the Whopper error. It was not an accounting issue. It was not a systems issue. It was a mistake. Carroll's CEO, Dan Cordino, said on an earnings call, without that error, the company's same-store sales would have been at 7.4%, well above the Burger King average. He called the mistake a one-time error. It's not a good look to take comfort in others' misfortunes, of course, but there's a small reassurance here for all of us. Sometimes you make a mistake, and if it's a real Whopper, yuck, 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 get it? But, okay, but tomorrow, and it's a real Whopper. Okay. All right. Okay, so I just knew they had to throw that lame joke in there somewhere in this article. But tomorrow's a new day. And once you've fessed up, it's an opportunity to move on. Here, here, brother. Everyone makes mistakes, right? Indeed. Move it on. Oh, yeah, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, phone lines are wide open. You want to call in, talk about anything? I'm here for you, ladies and gentlemen, and that number is 657-383-1825. 657-383-1825. Got, I don't know, about 48 minutes left in the big show, so feel free. Love to have callers on the show. Here we go. Last month. Oh, wait a minute. Andreesen Horowitz launches free crypto startup school. Last month, Andreesen Horowitz general partner Chris Dixon announced a TechCrunch disrupt that the VC firm would run a free crypto startup school. And the company is officially launching its school today. Applications are now open and you have 4 weeks to apply. With this initiative, A16Z wants to democratize cryptocurrencies. Dixon and the A16Z team has been involved in the cryptocurrency blockchain space for 7 years. And the firm now wants to share some of its learnings with entrepreneurs. This way, it could give a boost to the crypto community, which could create investment opportunities for an A16Z down the road. A16Z says clearly that participating in the crypto startup school doesn't mean you'll receive an investment from A16Z. It also positions A16Z as a thoughtful investor when it comes to crypto startup investments, not just for participants of the crypto startup school, but for the crypto community at large. The A16Z Crypto Startup School will be a 7-week program that starts February 21st, 2020. The program is free, and A16Z doesn't take any equity. Lectures will take place in Menlo Park. Oh, so you have to be based in Silicon Valley or willing to spend a couple of months there. And because A16Z knows that it can be challenging to move to another country just to attend this program, the firm will also be recording all lectures. Anyone will be able to watch videos and download curriculum materials later. Here's a sneak peek of the course outline. What are crypto networks and why do they matter? Blockchain computing primitives, cryptography and consensus. Overview of application development tools. Applications today in 2025. Crypto business models. Crypto economics. UX, product development and security. Go-to-market strategy and developer relations. Community participation and governance. Regulatory landscape and considerations. Guide to fundraising. As you can see, it's a mix of lectures purely focused on cryptocurrencies, as well as broader startup 101 lessons, fundraising, go-to-market strategy, etc. The program is looking for 20 to 25 teams, which should represent approximately 40 participants. You should have prior experience when it comes to building software products, but you don't need to be a crypto expert. Participants can expect 12 to 15 hours of lectures, workshops, mentorship, and networking opportunities per week. At the end of the course, participants will showcase a project idea or a prototype during a demo day. All right, and let's see here. Might have a little video clip about this as well. Let me see how user-friendly this is. Okay. Okay. Oh. Quit moving around me.
Alexa, play Weekend Mix.
The new Lincoln MKC. Connecting the world inside with the world outside. So you can make your flow a little easier. Introducing the well-connected 2019 Lincoln MKC.
So I wanted to start this panel with a cryptocurrency joke, so here it is. Litecoin. Okay, only a few people got that, but in honor of our previous guest, I want to make one Will Smith joke. So what does Will Smith say when he asks for Bitcoin, but somebody pays him in dollars? I don't know. Oh no, you did not shoot that green shit at me. Okay, so less of a laughing matter is Libra, Facebook's cryptocurrency that some people are worried is going to crater the world financial system. And the French finance minister said we cannot authorize development of Libra on European soil. But you are a Libra Association member, and Andreesen Horowitz is. So do you think that Libra is actually going to launch in the next year or two?
Yes, I do. So maybe stepping back, I could say, so we're very excited about cryptocurrency, and the way we view it is in the context of the history of computing. So if you go back to the history of computing, every 10 to 15 years is a new kind of major computing cycle. Mainframe computers, PCs, the internet, smartphones. We're in a period now where a whole bunch of interesting new computing platforms are getting built out. So for example, virtual reality, augmented reality, self-driving cars, bunch of stuff in AI is very exciting, and then we think blockchains are also a new type of computing system that has a lot of interesting possibilities. When you create a blockchain, there's a lot of different possible applications. So people have probably heard of Bitcoin and Ethereum. Those blockchains make certain sort of technical trade-offs that make them good for some applications and not for other applications. What Libra is doing, which we're excited about, is they're designing a blockchain from scratch that's built to optimize for payments. And what does that mean? It means you need, for example, the stability of the currency. So a currency that is denominated in something like dollars. So when you pay a merchant, they actually get the dollars, and also something that has very high throughput. And we think they've done a really good job on the design of that. There are all sorts of, as you said, regulatory and other kinds of questions. But do you think it's going to launch in the next year or two? I do. Yeah, I do. I think I don't know if there will have to be changes made, and it's going to be a dialogue with regulators and the partners and various other kind of stakeholders as to exactly what the design will be. But look, this is crypto is a global movement. China has said that blockchain is a national priority. It's happening all of these kinds of projects and things are happening all over the world. The benefits could be immense. So, for example, there are something on the order of 2 billion people who have smartphones today, but don't have access to sort of the modern banking system, as an example. And many of those people use applications like WhatsApp. And so to provide a payment system that's, sorry, I think my sound's going out, to provide a payment system and sort of to include those people in the financial system, while also providing a way for software developers and entrepreneurs to build applications on top that serve those people. It's a very powerful idea. It's very exciting to have a company the size of Facebook kind of supporting that. I hope that it's beginning of a process whereby more large tech companies get into the space. To me, I know you're a fan of VR, like I am. Facebook's doing a lot of investment there. I would love to see more companies do investment there. Generally, at our firm, we are very much pro innovation. We're pro entrepreneurs. We want to see new technologies develop, and so the more people that are getting involved, the better. And it's awesome that Facebook is making such a big investment here. And yeah, so I do think it'll launch. And I do think it'll launch. I think there's a dialogue. It's complicated. First, it's creating an association, which we're part of, which is happening now, and then that association will have a dialogue with regulators and with various other stakeholders, and make sure that what is created is something that benefits sort of all different constituencies. So, and then that may involve changes to the project.
What changes do you think the Libra Association would be flexible with? What could change that might help regulators come to terms with?
Well, I think one thing is, if you look at how it was received, a lot of people thought they were trying to create a new currency that was sort of a national currency. I think it's much better to think of it as a payment system.
So what would change to make people not think that?
So, for example, denominating the currency in U.S. dollars. I mean, I'm giving a hypothetical example, but that's the kind of thing. I don't think the intention was. My understanding is the intention was never to create sort of a new currency. If you see some of the various comments around it, it's much more focused on the payment rails, providing a payment system that one, lowers fees, two, includes those 2 billion people that aren't currently included, and three, allows a platform where developers can build on top of it the way they build applications on the App Store or something like that, right? And so,
got it. Okay, so most recently, we've heard that Visa and MasterCard are considering how to pull back from the Libra Association because they're not really enjoying all of this legal scrutiny. What do you think about that? Are they kind of traitors or just lacking courage?
I don't know the specifics of what they're doing. I think I would say just generally, it's when you create these new things, there's a tension between existing companies that have have some kind of stake in the status quo, and new technologies that So I don't know. Like, imagine if you tried to create YouTube back in whenever YouTube was started in, I think, 2005 or 6. And tried at the time to work with, incumbent media companies. There may have been challenges. What I think tends to happen over time, if you look at things like YouTube now, like all the media companies have presences on those networks. Sometimes it takes, first the way or Twitter or Facebook or any of these things, right? Sometimes it first requires kind of building something and getting people to use it, and then to really get the buy-in of the larger kind of incumbent players. So, but clearly, it's a big consortium. Complicated. There's a lot of different interests. That's something that needs to be managed.
But given all of the scrutiny and all of the toxic brand that Facebook has developed, is Andreesen Horowitz still comfortable connecting its brand with Facebook's through the Libra Association?
Well, so there's a very important thing I want to say about blockchains, which is I wrote an article in Wired about this. If you're interested, it's the phrase I like to use is blockchains instead of an era of don't be evil, it's an era of can't be evil. And what I mean by that is the way the whole concept of blockchain is it uses a game theoretic mechanism whereby it doesn't matter what the creator of the blockchain, their intentions are, or if they change their intention, it doesn't matter because it's baked into the code what the rules of the game are. And those rules cannot change, and they're open source and they're openly auditable. So I would say, regardless of what someone might think of Facebook, it's sort of a separate question. As long as the blockchain is architected in the correct way, you don't need to know, you don't need to trust their intentions. That's kind of one of the exciting things about this whole movement, is I think over the last 20 years, I think a lot of people feel like they made a kind of a deal. Like when you first joined Facebook or Twitter, whether you were a user or a media company, you made kind of a deal with that, an implicit deal, sometimes a real deal, like a terms of service and private, but sometimes an implicit deal that this is how the thing's going to operate. So if you go talk to a media company and how they feel about Facebook, they may feel like at first Facebook was very helpful, and then later on the rules changed, right? So one of the very important features of blockchains is that the rules are baked in from the start. They're transparent. They cannot change. Bitcoin was created by a pseudonymous person, Satoshi Nakamoto, that no one knows who that person is. It doesn't matter who that person is because the rules are baked into the network. That person could change, his or her mind. They could change their intentions. So I would just argue that like one of the key features here is that that you don't need to, right? You don't need to sort of understand or even care about the motives of people behind it.
So that works when there are rules written because the rules can't change. But we've seen a lot of problems stem from when the rules aren't written and what actually happens to those companies. And so most recently, the SEC only fined EOS maker Block One $24 million for their not quite legal securities sale from its ICO that raised $4.1 billion. So that's a 0.5% fine. Do you think that that's fair, and is that going to embolden bad actors?
I don't know the details of that, and the way these things work, it could be one of many. I don't know what's like. It could be the beginning of a process. I don't know.
It's supposed to not be. There's no.
We're not involved. We're not involved with that project. And I don't know the details, but I will say that we think we have from the start. For example, this whole ICO craze in 2017. We never participated in that. We never invested in any companies that did any of these ICOs or sort of unaccredited investor sales. We have believed from the start that it's very important to work with regulators, and so like the companies we're involved with take regulation very seriously in all the jurisdictions they're in, and we spend a lot of time on it. And like my partner Katie Hahn, like she's an expert in it, and we have a bunch of people at the firm who do it. I don't know enough about the details of that.
But do you think low fines for violations on lots of money raised might just lead bad actors to be like, well, sure, if the rules aren't perfectly clear, I'll just break them because who knows, in worst case scenario, I get a tiny slap on the wrist.
Well, I think one thing that'd be nice is if the rules were clear, right? One of the frustrations we have right now is just that there aren't, basically we've sort of asked for guidance and looked for more kind of clarity on the rules. And so some of these, I think some of these issues are, look, I'm sure there are bad actors who are doing scams and things like this. But I do think some of these situations were just simply the lack of clarity in the rules. So I don't know whether EOS is one of those cases, but I do think like there have been a number of cases where people thought they were complying with regulations and just didn't understand what they were because none of it's been clarified, frankly.
Speaking of that, when there's so much cryptocurrency snake oil out there, and obviously there's plenty of projects where it's just obvious it's not going to work. There's a lot wrong with it. But when you see a legitimate project that otherwise seems like it has real potential, what are those final red flags that you're still seeing in this day and age that dissuade you from wanting to invest or get involved?
Well, so I kind of feel like crypto today is a little bit like the early internet in that there was this sort of gold rush, right? And if you go back to the 90s, there were a lot of bad companies created. There were a lot of kind of these IPOs and other things that probably should never have, companies that never should have IPO'd. But there was also Google, Amazon, PayPal, Yahoo, and that's our view of the current crypto world is that there's a lot of things which we don't agree with how they're doing things. Maybe they shouldn't exist. But there's also a lot of really, really high quality entrepreneurs, some great technologies. Out of this, we believe there will be iconic new companies that are built.
But if I'm a company out there trying to be like, I want to be a legitimate company, I don't want suddenly people to say like, oh, I want to just back away. What are some red flags that they could get rid of or fix in their company?
Well, I think one of the core, what we believe is one of the core things that works in the startup world is a long-term focus where the employees, the founders, the investors, and users are all aligned around a goal. And so, for example, there are all sorts of best practices that emerged over the years with traditional startups about how to issue equity and how to treat your users and all sorts of other kinds of things, and take a long-term kind of win-win perspective on that. Some of that has been lost in the crypto world. So we we try to only work with entrepreneurs who have that. We have that. We have a venture fund that invests in, and it's a 10+ year venture fund, a very long-term perspective. We don't trade things. We buy, we invest, and we work as partners with founders. What we do find is a lot of people just don't know. It's such a new area. They don't know they don't know what the best practices are. And so for that reason, for example, I wanted to mention that we're going to run a startup school in February and March for crypto-specific kind of startup school that will take what we've learned over the last 7 years as kind of best practices in the category that I think haven't fully propagated out and people don't fully understand, and try to kind of share them with people that come to this class. And then we'll also put everything on YouTube and everything else. This is just a purely educational thing. We're not taking equity. We're not charging. It's something we feel like we're now far enough into this crypto movement that there are best practices, but people don't fully understand them yet. It reminds me of, I've been involved in startups for 15+ years. I used to be an entrepreneur, and back in the 2000s, there was all sorts of how do you build a product? How do you find founders? How do you raise money? And then there were a whole bunch of people like Y Combinator and a bunch of bloggers and other people who did a really great public service, which is they took all these best practices and they promulgated them. And so we're trying to do our part here on the crypto world and sort of say, here's what we've learned. Here's the best way to sort of think about regulatory, about organizational building, about business model, about go-to-market, about technology, and here are the best practices we've learned, and sort of share them in an open source way with the world.
Is the hope that these companies would then raise money from Andreesen? If you
Potentially they don't have to. I mean, we hope sort of in a karma building way that they would like us and come talk to us if they did that. But we generally, the way we look at these things is if we are kind of good community members and provide value to the community, that people will see that and hopefully want to work with us. But there's no requirement or anything like that.
So you spoke about trying to get there to be better, more legitimate rules, more clear rules, so that people know what to do and what not to do. But in May, you guys, Andreesen Horowitz, hosted officials from the Treasury Department, the SEC, and other regulators, along with your portfolio companies. It was kind of a closed-door meeting that people were a little bit surprised about because it's not usual for all of the regulators to get together with a private company like that. So what was the message that you were trying to convey to them?
Yeah, we were trying to create a dialogue. So you have these two...
A dialogue about what?
Over, what's the best way to balance innovation and regulatory concerns. And to, I think what we saw was we engaged with both constituencies, and we saw was a lot of misunderstandings. And so we held this event. By the way, we put everything on we videotaped the whole thing and put it on the internet. So it was pretty open. And it was a widely attended gathering. It's a regulatory term, meaning it was a whole bunch of people, including people outside of our firm. But the idea was to just sort of start a dialogue so that people, look, if all you do is read the kind of the news media reports about crypto, you see scams and hacks, and it just looks like this big, big messy thing of all these scammers and things. That's not our all.
It is a big messy thing.
There's a lot of there is messy stuff there, as there was in the early internet. I talked to Mark Andreesen about this a lot, and there was a lot of crazy stuff happening back in the 90s. He was writing, he saw it firsthand. So there is that certainly does exist, right? But we think that there is a lot of value in the technology, and we think I think it's important. I personally believe it should be an important national priority to make sure that we're the leader in it.
What was their biggest pushback about that? Saying yeah, we get that you want innovation, but here's why the regulation and the safety is more important. What was?
Well, I think a lot. I think there's different dimensions. That's a great question. I think partly it's just sort of an understanding, why are you doing this? So I gave a talk. It's on our website. I gave a talk just explaining why are we excited about this. Just sort of we had a bunch of entrepreneurs explain what they're doing, and just to see that there's real societal value potentially in technologies. And so that's one layer, sort of creating a shared understanding. And then I think there's a lot of just frankly technical questions. So there's if you look at the way that the regulatory frameworks work around securities and commodities, and SEC and the CFTC, there's 70 years of knowledge kind of baked into these rules, and they've seen various eras and all sorts of stuff. And so there's just a lot of sort of also technical questions, like what is the best practice? What should because we believe the right business model for these companies is to in many cases to have sort of coins and tokens associated with their projects, and to give those to employees, and to have, so for example, our standard thing is like, we'll invest, we'll buy tokens. They'll use that money to fund the company operations. The employees will be incentivized that way, kind of analogous to stock options. And then at some point over time, with the right vesting put in place and the right lockup rules and things like that, there might be opportunity for other people to participate in that. But like, there need to be all sorts of safeguards. You can't have sort of what are effectively unregulated security offerings. And so, so I think there's sort of both like a shared understanding dimension to that is what we're trying to do. And then also start to begin to work out some of these more technical questions of like, what is the right regulatory framework?
So just finally, one of your big investment theses is following nerd energy, or the places where engineers are really geeking out and oftentimes building something that suddenly becomes mainstream important. What areas are you seeing losing nerd energy, and which areas are gaining that nerd energy?
Yeah, by the way, I say that I've written blog posts about this. I think I use the word nerd, by the way, very affectionately.
Oh, me too.
Okay, so this is like a positive thing. What I mean by that is sort of, you look at the history of Silicon Valley.
Which ones are the ones, we don't have too much time, so I just want to see, like,
sure.
Which ones are gaining nerd energy?
I mean, I think to me, the by far the biggest kind of nerd energy thing is crypto. So that's why I'm sort of all in on this. And just a ton of really smart people, and it's misunderstood, and, it skews, like, all the really smart technical people are in it, like, are really in it and deeply passionate, and they, like, it's off the charts. I think, like, VR, I know it's the profit is illusion right now. I think the Oculus Quest is a breakout product. I love, like, the Oculus Quest subreddit is one of my favorite things to read every day. So I don't know. I think that's like a really interesting area.
Any areas we might not think of? I think like crypto and VR have been around for a minute. But.
Yeah, no, I think some of these things, some of them have, like, AI used to be one, right? Or machine learning specifically, but that has obviously transitioned to the mainstream. I'm still very into hardware. I know hardware is out of fashion in the startup venture world right now, I think, I think, I don't know, like, I personally spend my weekends, with Arduinos, 3D printers, and I think I love all that world of sort of course hardware. I think it's very exciting, and I think that's sort of not, as in right now, I guess.
So quickly, just to recap some of the interesting points, Chris does think that Libra is going to launch in the next few years, but one option might be changing its denomination from Libra to US dollars to make regulators a little bit more comfortable with it. And obviously, there's going to be big companies that have a stake in the status quo that might be interested in pulling back because they don't need it to succeed. But after this whole gold rush, if we can focus more on the long term and get everyone aligned, from the investors to the employees to the users, with the right incentives, crypto might be able to last a little bit longer. But we're going to need stronger rules and to answer all those technical questions of regulators. But if you're looking for the next big area, augmented reality, virtual reality are still in, but there's plenty to build in cryptocurrency. So hope you guys find whatever the rest of the
Can I say one last thing, which is, if you're interested in the crypto startup school, if you go to a6z.com, we have a place where you can put in your email address, and we'll send more information when we have it. Great. So
thank you guys all for watching.
All right, thanks, fellas. Thank you for that very informative report. All right, moving on. By the way, I've got 20 minutes left in the big show. Caller lines are still wide open. So if you'd like to call in, please feel free. That number is 657-383-1825. 657-383-1825. Let me dig up the next story here. Timely top stories in the world of finance. Coming at you on the rant, Charles Lamson. It's more about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. From the fine folks at CoinDesk. Sebastian Sinclair, to be more precise. View. Bitcoin's short-term 50-period moving average is edging closer toward the longer-term 100-period moving average on the weekly chart, hinting at a potential bullish golden cross formation for the first time in 3.5 years. In the shorter term, however, total weekly volume has fallen period to period as indecision continues to grip the market. Price action is caught between the 100-day and 200-day moving averages, MAs. The next major move, either way, is likely to determine a trend bias going forward. If a firm close above or below those averages is confirmed. Bitcoin, BTC, looks on track to produce a bullish long-term signal not seen in 3.5 years. The 50-year period and the 100-period MAs have edged closer together on the weekly chart after BTC rebounded from $7,293 to $10,350 on October 26th, according to Bitstamp data. Across of the 50-period MA, moving up above the slower 100-period MA, known as a golden cross, generally hints at a strong shift in a trend and can act as confirmation of a bullish bias for the long-term view. The last time that bull cross occurred on the weekly chart was way back in May 2016, when the price of BTC started rising from $438 to near $20,000 in December 2017. 4,800% increase. If the MAs continue to converge as currently, the cross looks likely in late December or early 2020. But it's still too early for a precise call. There is inherent risk involved with making such comparisons from previous years, as market conditions have changed significantly. Yet there is merit for seeking additional confirmation in the long-term trend. Since BTC's minor reward halving in May 2020 is likely to stir up a bunch of market activity as the supply cutting event approaches. Total weekly volume has shrunk from 2 weeks ago, an indication of market indecision on a fairly stagnant price, while the RSI is barely trending bullish above 52.7, neutral being 50. However, should the two lines converge and then cross bullish, that would be a strong indication that the 2019 reversal rally has legs, with a strong fundamental event for BTC occurring right around the corner. It's important to take note of the bullish signals on the larger time frames. More immediately, the daily chart suggests market equilibrium as prices have been largely stuck within a $650 range for nearly 2 weeks. BTC's price action has been caught between the 100-day and 200-day MAs for 12 days. Generally speaking, when prices are above the 200-day MA, the long-term trend can be considered bullish. Conversely, if prices are beneath the 100-day MA, then that is an indication of midterm 30 to 60-day bearish conditions. The current scenario highlights the indecisive sentiment felt across the market. A repeated failure to close above the 100-day MA could open up doors to $8,800 in the immediate short term, as previously discussed. Indecision will continue until a firm close above $9,573 100-day MA or below $9,180 200-day MA occurs with conviction. Until then, continued sideways ranging can be expected. Disclosure: the author holds no cryptocurrency assets at the time of writing. Further disclosure: I, Charles Lamson, hold no cryptocurrency assets at the time of writing. Okay, so, right at the time of reading this writing, as it were. All right, moving on from town to town. Okay. Podcast, Meltem, Demirors on the three things Bitcoin represents. Okay, let's untangle that a bit. Says Meltem Demirors, the chief strategy officer of CoinShares. Bitcoin represents three different things. Okay, this goes on. All right, this is basically a podcast. Let's see. Is this even? Let's see. I think. Well, heck. Right. All right. How user friendly is this now? Meltem Demiror's podcast. Come on, baby. Nope. Hello. Not hearing anything. I don't hear anything. Hello, are you there? Okay.
Welcome to Bitcoin Macro, a pop-up podcast produced as part of the CoinDesk Invest New York conference in November. I'm your host, Nolan Bauer. Both the podcast and the event explore the intersection of Bitcoin and the global macroeconomy with perspectives from some of the leading thinkers in finance, crypto, and beyond.
I'm delighted to be joined today by Meltem Demirors, one of the most famous people in crypto, that's for sure. Meltem has been around for a long time, but really sprung to international prominence with her amazing testimony in front of the House of Congress committee this past summer on the whole Libra offering. But people who have been working in cryptocurrencies for a long time have always been aware of Meltem's brilliance, and she's been kind enough to join us for today's podcast. This podcast is really trying to look at Bitcoin's place in the world today and is a taste of the type of content that we're going to be focusing on in New York City on November 12th at Invest. So welcome, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Nolan. That was such a beautiful intro. I feel like I'd love to have you intro me all the time.
Definitely. I've had the good fortune of knowing you for quite a while now, and watching you gather all of this ability to sort of let your ideas shine on the global stage has been a real treat, and I'm happy to have even met you on the train back from Washington that day.
That's right. I think I was enjoying a Bud Light.
You definitely earned it. You definitely earned it. So let's jump right in. We're talking about Bitcoin in the world today, and the first question I have really is around whether or not you see Bitcoin as a true macro asset. Is it there? Is it in the main stage? Is it in the side stage somewhere? Is it in the wings? Or is this really something that can be thought of as a macro asset today?
I think for most people in the world right now, particularly in the world of investing and finance, Bitcoin and crypto assets are not yet an asset they think about. It's a very small asset class. It's around 200 to 250 billion right now. That's very small. And so for most investors looking to allocate capital, moving even $5 to $10 million into Bitcoin creates a lot of price movement, and there are not really efficient ways to do that today. So that's one concern, I think, certainly. I think the other piece to think about just on a macro level that's really relevant is macro investors sort of define the world in the context of specific assets and markets, And so I think as an investor, you look at sovereign debt, you look at debt generally as an asset class, corporate debt, bonds, you look at equities, and then a lot of people like to lump crypto under the alternatives category. Alternatives is sort of a growing part of the investment world, and I think it's challenging for a lot of investors, even in the alternative space, to really try to figure out where Bitcoin fits in. And so I think that the big challenge is to people in our industry, we like to talk about Bitcoin as an asset class because we live, breathe, eat, sleep crypto all day, every day. And certainly in our little part of the world, Bitcoin feels like the big asset. But I think, frankly, to most investors, Bitcoin's not really on their consciousness. And if it is, I think it's far too early. And if anything, the place where folks are getting exposure is through their PA or personal account, certainly not through their firm or their fund. And I don't think that's going to change in the near future. We can talk about that more as well.
So in practice, what you're saying is it's not quite there yet. If it was in this sort of macro level, the features that would define it, the aspects of it that would sort of propel it forward, I think we can even trace to some of your testimony back in Washington in July. In that testimony, I think what we saw was, you had Facebook, which was almost threatening, not a nation state, but it was taking on certain powers. It was taking on certain responsibilities that we would normally prescribe to a nation state. And it was saying, we're going to issue this private money. That, of course, got everyone's backup. I think one of the things that was remarkable about your testimony is you showed that Bitcoin didn't propose the same changes, yet it is coherently creating what amounts to a digital jurisdiction at the same time, and is perhaps is it the foundation for this type of macro asset going forward, the foundation for what could amount to an important money supply, hard money supply?
Let's untangle that a bit. So I think what's challenging when we talk about Bitcoin is, unlike debt or equities, Bitcoin represents three different things. Bitcoin is technology in the context of the Bitcoin protocol, which is open source code, and open source software has been a part of our world for a long time. And open source, I think, is starting to gain acceptance as an investable category in the venture world and beyond. And so Bitcoin at its core is the Bitcoin protocol. Bitcoin is a network, and what's interesting here is Bitcoin is kind of a supranational global communication network. And so there are tens of thousands of devices around the world, whether people are running miners or people are just running full nodes. There's this network of computational devices that are maintaining the Bitcoin ledger and engaging in validating transactions and maintaining the integrity of the ledger. And so the Bitcoin network is physical in nature. And then lastly, you have Bitcoin, the asset. And so what I think is interesting here is, for a traditional investor, it's sort of a challenging paradigm when these three things are wrapped together. So when you see people look at Bitcoin, they'll talk about Bitcoin in the context of software infrastructure. You'll hear people talking about Bitcoin in the context of a commodity because it's produced and it's mined digitally in the way that we sort of think about producing and mining things like gold and oil that are limited in supply, theoretically. And then you have people talking about it in the context of currency, of hard money. What I think is interesting about Libra is Libra styles itself as a cryptocurrency, but really the point I was trying to make in Congress is anyone can call anything a cryptocurrency, but that does not make it so. And what's interesting about Bitcoin is unlike a commodity, unlike a bond, unlike an equity, Bitcoin is backed by nothing but the demand for it. And so it's a little bit unique in that regard. It has no physicality, which I think is part of a larger conversation about the evolution from, highly physical world to one where we increasingly engage digitally. So that's difficult for people to grasp. It doesn't necessarily fit into the constructs we have for assets in our world. Even assets that have been dematerialized, like stocks that trade, they still have a physical share certificate that sits somewhere. And then I think the other component that's interesting is when we look at what Libra is comprised of and what it proposes to do, it's really just a pooled investment vehicle where the interest and the fees accrue to the association. And so I think it's an interesting series of choices made by Facebook. I'm not really clear as to why they felt this was the best approach. But I think if you look at the intent of Libra, it's a pool of capital. You're taking money from people who purchase the tokens. You're putting it into currencies and interest-bearing instruments, and you're holding it, and then you're distributing that plus transaction fees to people who participate in this private closed sort of group called the Libra Association. And so to me, that's sort of the antithesis of Bitcoin. So my only goal really in that testimony was to help clarify that Bitcoin is not Libra. Bitcoin is separate and distinct from every other cryptocurrency, and it has features that make it incredibly unique. And Libra and many things are, in fact, not cryptocurrencies. There's a lot of ambiguity in language that's certainly having specificity in how we use these terms is starting to become more and more important, particularly for regulators, policymakers who are trying to understand what's happening, but sometimes the translation they're getting isn't particularly helpful and in fact can be more confusing than not.
So I want to pick up on two things that you said, and you said that Libra is, of course, this pool investment, so the incentives of all these parties are definitely for transaction fees. But you also mentioned that because Bitcoin is only backed by the demand of the user, that it really can exist an uncorrelated asset because it isn't, Libra would theoretically be involved in all the ups and downs of a typical economy. Because Bitcoin is only really, the value of Bitcoin is only really based on the demand that users and people have for it, can it behave as a safe haven asset?
I think the idea of safe haven is an interesting conversation. I think the way people typically frame this is this a risk on or a risk off asset. And I think the challenge with safe haven is, again, everything's relative. So if I live in the United States and I have US dollars and I have a driver's license and I have a bank account and a debit card, I probably don't view Bitcoin as a safe haven asset because the dollar is pretty safe for me and I'm able to do everything I want, and I don't necessarily in times of crisis feel that the dollar depreciates rapidly, and so my purchasing power parity, my PP stays intact. Now conversely, if I live in a part of the world where there is a lot of instability and volatility, I'm from Turkey personally. I was just there and speaking to people about Bitcoin. I think within the Bitcoin community, there's this idea that people who live in regimes or parts of the world where the price, their purchasing power parity or their ability to buy the same basket of goods fluctuates a lot because of the fluctuations in the value of their local currency. I think in our community, we like to believe that they're going to just rush to adopt Bitcoin and go out and hold Bitcoin. And it's really fun.
All right, into the big show. Thank you all for tuning in.
They don't want to hold Bitcoin. They want US dollars. And so this is where I think
until next time,
challenge emerges.
Don't take any wooden nickels.
Explaining new asset class and also really understanding some of the macroeconomic shifts happening in our world. We live in a dollar-denominated world today. And at the end of the day, we can't get
all right. And to all my YouTube watchers, thanks for tuning in.
Someday you'll be able to, and there's certainly a number of companies I invested in.
Until next time, don't take any wooden nickels, ladies and gentlemen.
But I think